Welcome back to the 283rd episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories. You know, Joe Biden's been talking about the wealth tax, so we're going to talk about the proposals, the overall idea for taxing the wealthy, then a new proposal that's being put out by some groups to actually do it. So those are two separate articles, and then we'll be tackling one final article about a constitutional amendment that actually addresses the immunity issue that the Supreme Court decided on Monday. And we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, for a long time, they have been discussing in Washington and in academia the idea of taxing wealth. And there has been this notion thrown around that unrealized gains on stocks, if you don't actually sell it, you don't actually see the profit flow into your income, and it doesn't come into your bank account, but it's sitting there, well, we may tax you on that. And then there's the question of, well, it's kind of hard to tax art and other assets like this, and that's how wealthy people keep their money. So there are ways that we've tried and have always been proposed to really get at that. So my question to you is, are these sort of asset taxes, not when you pass away, not things like a property tax, but other things like, art, stocks, and other unique, maybe private businesses, are taxing those sort of things good or bad? Does it encourage certain things? Does it actually discourage other sort of things? And I'm being very broad here because I want you to fill it in with what you think it encourages, discourages, because everybody's going to come to this with their different perspectives. Throw it down in the comment section. Love to hear what everybody has to think. So, or have to say. If you're just thinking, you're not typing it, then that's not the point. I want you to throw it down there in the comment section. So let's jump into our first article that comes from Common Dreams. Headline reads, "Tax the wealthy and reject austerity for a more just and thriving democracy." So we know where Common Dreams comes from, and they have been on this road for quite some time. They have been talking about addressing what they see as a deep inequality within our system, and the fact that a certain percentage of people, they either don't pay their full taxes, or there's a certain group that just isn't able to take advantage of certain loopholes, and they are left out of the large share of the economic pie that they deserve to get, whether that be through redistribution or whether that be through more fair tax policy in the very beginning and not necessarily redistribution. There have been multiple authors taking multiple different stances. Well, now they have another author taking another stance. So I want to really highlight where they start. So we're going to start from the very first paragraph, just so you understand the tone of this article from the very beginning. Quote, "2 of the last 5 presidents won office over the objection of the majority of the people. California with, 65 times more people has the same voting power in the U.S. Senate as Wyoming, and the U.S. Supreme Court just permitted South Carolina lawmakers to dilute black votes in drawing districts. These obvious flaws undermine our claim to be a strong democracy. One less appreciated but similarly undemocratic trend is our extreme inequality that supercharges the power and wealth of corporations and the uber-rich, weakens what the public sector can deliver, and often feeds on itself." End quote. So you see where they're starting here, and it's a great appeal to the equality mindset, the idea that not every single person's vote is considered the same, or the representation that they get is not necessarily equal. That is a great appeal to equality, because whether or not you agree or disagree with the system, the republic system that we have, rather than a pure democracy, if you were to just take it on pure facts alone, it does not on its face seem fair that 65 people, for every one person in Wyoming that is represented by a senator, it's 65 times more people. Or it's a little bit it's not necessarily as simple as that math, but my point being that the outsized power of Wyoming is something that would not just appear fair on a ground basis. Now, if we go to the House of Representatives, guess who has some of the largest amounts of representatives there, California. So it's a balance of the different systems for sure. The Electoral College is also something that would definitely be called out because it's not just direct democracy. And it is very important to the underlying part of this author's argument that we're trying to have the most fair system possible. And also, she just wants to call out the criticism that, oh, we're a democracy, which technically we're not a democracy. If we were just a democracy, then at the end of the day, we wouldn't even need representation. We would just say, okay, hey, here is an amendment. Here is an addendum item that we want passed. There would be like a few bureaucrats that would put it onto the ballot. They would make sure everything's facilitated, and we would vote directly on most issues. That would be a pure democracy. At that point, we wouldn't debate about whether people are being properly represented. We wouldn't say, oh, well, the will of the people isn't being issued. It would be pure majoritarianism. And on some issues, I'm sure that a lot of people would really like that. And on other issues, probably not, because even though we have a two-party system and we have two distinct groups of ideology, that doesn't mean everybody neatly falls into it, because it even comes true with this sort of issue, with taxing the wealth of different individuals. If you just frame the question differently, all it takes is asking a question differently in a survey, and you're going to get vastly different responses. If you say, should the wealthy pay their fair share, you're going to get probably 65-70% of people to have a agreement that yes, we should have people taxed. But then if you say, in order to make a more, even if you say with the words in front of it, even to make a more fair tax system, should we have a death tax? Should we have an inheritance tax? You're going to have a vast swing, not necessarily to the same level. It will probably be like 60% of the population isn't going to be the same. The Bush and Cheney White House did copious, and let's be clear, theirs was about messaging more than actual policy, but they did copious studies about this in order to get their inheritance tax policies passed, which is basically saying we should try to limit it as much as possible. So the thing about framing is so very, very important, and to actually be able to parse it, how to make sure that every single bureaucrat that would put something out there and in a world where we're a pure democracy isn't the language isn't biased to get people just to agree with one way or the other, depending on whether or not the language is completely leaning one side of the issue or another. I mean, it's crazy, but the whole point being that we have a representative democracy, we have a republic for a reason, which is we have to put power into some people and we have to trust them to get the job done. But the author is right to point out that because of the centralization of that control, of basically saying everybody who is a political actor, everybody who's been elected by the people, we're going to have them go to one city. We're going to have them there for a certain amount of time. That allows corporations to send in lobbyists to that one town. They can actually spend less money than trying to convince people all across the United States. If they can do it on a state level, of course, but if they want to do it on a federal level, they just send people directly to the center of power in DC. So the author is definitely right about that. There's definitely a concentration of power, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most fair in the world, but lobbyists and people who do want to influence things, they want to change how the system operates to benefit themselves, have an easier job doing it sending people to DC. That is one thing that comes with more centralized control of any government, whether it be a democratic government, whether it be a oligarchy, which would kind of be weird because an oligarchy would already have the direct interests of the really wealthy, but maybe it's an intellectual oligarchy where it's the best advisors who are selected, the best intellectuals. Even then, if it's a concentrated group, then the wealthiest among them could come and give them fine wine, dine them, things like that. You would see this sort of thing in lots of different countries in the past. So my point being that while I don't necessarily agree right off the bat with the assessment of having to 100% tax the wealthy, I think that the criticisms in the base of them are interesting, need to be delved into more, and the solution to what she sees as a problem, and let's be clear, that's why I pointed this out at the very beginning, because this is how she frames it. This is what she sees as one of the crucial issues. The solution to her problem I don't necessarily agree with, but I agree that there is something there with the problem, and it is something that needs to be addressed. But there is more here. It's not just this little one paragraph that I want to pick on. I want to go into a little bit more, which comes into the second section, first paragraph of that section, and we may get into one more paragraph. It just depends on how long I actually talk about this one. Quote, wealth is unequally distributed in the United States, more than any other wealthy countries and more now than in our own recent history. Concentration of wealth leaves millions struggling. Citizens United and other Supreme Court decisions let the wealthy and corporations exert undue political power, destabilizing our communities. The elite sway voters with exorbitant spending on political ads, capture politicians with campaign contributions, and lobby elected officials to do their bidding, often undermining policy solutions supported by the public. So all of those things are 100% true. Money can be used to buy patronship from the people in Washington. It can be used to sway voters. All of these things are 100% true. The question is, do you go after the root of their money, which can be used for other things, helping their community thrive, employing people, things of this, or do you just say that they can't use their money in a very particular way? So I'm going to step into a world where I'm okay with the federal government being very vindictive and very willing to interfere, and I'm okay with it on a personal level in this theoretical world where, yes, okay, we're giving a lot of power to the government and they can determine what they're going to do with it. And both of the proposals I'm about to put forward need to exist in this world. We can mandate how people can spend their money and try to limit it from political spending, or the opposite one, where we are allowed to take almost 60-70% of their wealth, so then inherently they don't have enough power and wealth to actually influence politics. One of those directly addresses it while not trying to limit, suffocate, and steal from people more than we already do. And one of those is trying to reach a specific end while also trying to reach a different end, which is just take their wealth away because they shouldn't be that wealthy. And yes, there are lots of assumptions baked into exactly what I just said. But even if we try to remove those and we're as kind as possible to the idea of just stripping people of their wealth, and laying out here, because with the underlying reasoning being, or at least a justification being, that money is being ill-used in order to buy favor with politicians and influence people, I think the first solution is better. I think if we're removing the assumptions, if we're going based on her argument here, I think if we're trying to reach that political end that she talks about, saying that we're going to take their money away overall, which could still be used in a beneficial way to the community and the people of the United States, whether it's a large corporation or a small private business, I think that is less advantageous than just saying, hey, no, you wealthy people, even you normal people, you can't spend exorbitant amounts of money. Maybe there's a hard cap on the amount of money. Maybe we eliminate super PACs and then we go back to hard caps on political campaigns. Maybe we go back to hard caps on lobbying groups. In lobbying groups, they're not going to like that. They're going to go and lobby the different politicians to not do that. So it's hard to say that's going to pass. And that's another issue. That's another area where I could definitely see the author making a counter argument and me having to sit back and kind of agree a little bit, which is if we want these sort of changes, instead, so the reason that this would probably be a good argument for taxing the wealthy is because this is a roundabout way of defanging them and taking their power away. So then for other political changes, such as limiting the amount of money anybody could give, they wouldn't have as much money to influence people. I think you could make a argument along those lines, and I would be relatively sympathetic because it is true. The people that are currently in power have their ties with all their different lobbying groups, and the lobbying groups have their phone numbers, and all these different wealthy individuals, they go to soirees with them, they have their connections, and all it takes is giving one or two extra calls, an extra donation here or there to at least have time given to them to hear out their perspective versus the average Joe Schmo that's in their district that isn't able to give as much, that isn't able to be heard, and that's going to influence whether or not things like a wealth tax would actually get implemented, or in the case that we were talking about, of limiting the amount of money that can go to these politicians. The politicians don't, if you ask the American people, they want term limits. A lot of people don't actually agree with, there's actually a very interesting conversation by one person I actually very respect saying, I don't know if we should have term limits. And I was like, are you just being contrarian, or is this like the new vein? Because for a while, having term limits was a little bit contrarian. But if you ask the politicians, not the outside world, even the commentariat class, they would agree that, okay, hey, no, we don't want term limits. The people, the politicians, no, we don't want that. It's not in our interest. Just like if we were to propose stopping money going to their campaigns over a certain amount, that's not going to benefit the politicians, because then they have to go for a broader appeal and get more people to come in, and they can't just go to their big donors, and the big donors aren't going to like that either. So it's not in their benefit. It's not in their, if you're looking at the equation, their cost benefit analysis, they're like, no, we're not going to do that. So I can understand where the author would make an argument along those lines, that first we have to address the wealth that is affecting the system, and then once that's removed, once we actually get rid of the wealth that could possibly influence it, then we can make changes to it, because then the wealthy wouldn't have as much influence, which is a very, still, once again, a very roundabout way of doing it. I could understand the practical arguments that they're making. I would still return to, are the costs worth the benefits? You're stripping people of their hard-earned money. That is and this is different than money that they have actually just earned, but money that they are saving, money that they are reinvesting, especially when you talk about private businesses. And that's an interesting part of the next article that we're going to go into. When they talk about this new idea of taxing wealth, it's not just, assets that are hard to appraise, like stocks or not realized stocks or art or things like this. It actually includes things like private businesses. And this is the natural outgrowth of taxing wealth, because they say, okay, well, if we can access this wealth that hasn't technically been realized yet, or we don't have a clear valuation for yet, why can't we access this? Especially with the way that they want to do it, because it basically is a voucher system that says, oh, you'll pay us later. And we get, never mind. Okay, I'm going to just finish up with this article, then we'll jump into that one, because it's very, very interesting to say the least. It is a very roundabout way of getting at people's wealth, and this is exactly what happens when proposals like this are taken too far. When you say, okay, we need to tax the wealthy, make them pay their fair share, even though the top 1% pays a majority of the actual income. And what I mean by that is the actual money brought in by the IRS, the majority of it comes from the wealthiest 10%. So whether or not they're paying their fair share, I guess the argument would be that they're not paying the same effective tax rate, but yet they're bringing in more revenues to the IRS than the other tax brackets. So I could see where both arguments have their flaws, and I also see where they have their points. But the idea that we need to go after this excessive wealth and we need to pin these people down, whether or not you agree, it breeds these sort of ideas that seem a little bit absurd when you actually start to break down on it, because they are so single focused about just finding a way to get at the wealth. And that is when we start having things like this next article, what they call ultras. It comes from the American Institute of Economic Research, and the headline reads, "Ultras, the worst idea you have never heard of." And that's because it's a new idea. I mean, kind of. They're proposing this in different, I believe it was Duke is where they had the very first study that mentioned these by name, and I want to make sure that I'm not crazy. Yes, so it was a 2023 Duke Journal article, and I'll just read the excerpt that they have in this article from that journal article, the law journal. Quote, "It seems like it should be simple to know how much a thing is worth. Modern securities markets track value by the nanosecond. Websites instantly appraise our houses, cars, and collectibles. The difficulty is that a modest but important portion of wealth held by the world's richest individuals is not publicly traded securities or even expensive homes, but instead complex assets such as intellectual property rights or stakes in private businesses. Far from being traded every nanosecond, many of these are hardly ever sold at all." And that's what we were talking about. They are hard to evaluate because at the end of the day, you don't know if the price is going to be 10 times what it was when you bought it. So do you do your taxes based on the value at buying, or do you do the taxes based at the value of selling? Well, the argument would be, no, we're trying to tax the wealth, not just the flows in and out of money from that person. So they have to come up with a new system for evaluating it in the middle, or not even necessarily evaluating it actively, but having something that works throughout the span of the existence of the asset or the holding of the asset by the individual. Quote, I'll finish here. Quote, Zillow and other websites estimate valuations by examining sales of comparable properties, but the relative unique nature of a business or intellectual property rights can make that challenging. So you can see where they're poking around. They're like, okay, how do we get at this one? And I will read the name of Ultras out to you because it is actually, it's so amazing. I'll be honest. I read it. I was like, oh, that is actually very, very clever the way that they want to go about it. So I'll read the section before it, and then we'll go on to the part where they actually talk about what it is as an acronym, because it is an acronym. It does actually stand for something. Quote, but that suggests another problem, a really vexing problem. Even if you want to tax wealth, how do you estimate the value of wealth? So you can apply a tax rate. President Biden's proposal is 2%. Senator Warren's proposal is 3%. But 2 or 3% of what? The answer from inventive minds of wealth taxers is ultra simple. Oh, look at that little game they're playing there with that little wordplay. Seriously, it's ultras. So let's go through it here. Or unliquidated tax reserve accounts. So un for the U, liquidated L, T tax, R reserve A accounts, and then ultras for multiple of them. This might seem like a simple way of using in-kind tax payments, but there's really much more to it, is what the article is trying to get at. So let me ask you a question. If you own a business and you have signed a contract with the person that you are leasing the building from, and you say, if I don't have to pay rent on this building for the duration of my time here, what I want to do with you is every single year, I am going to give you 2% of the current holdings in equity of the current holdings that I have of the company. So you start with something like you have 100%, and then at the end of the year, you say to that person, okay, hey, for all the rent I didn't pay you, I'm going to give you 2%. That means that I have 98 now. That means that you get 2%. The next year comes around and you say, okay, now you get 2% of my 98, which means you're going to be around 96.4. And you can see here that in theory, as the value of the company would go up, and you're actually technically giving a smaller amount of the 100%, but you're still giving the same amount of the percentage that you own. So your payments would be getting lesser, quote unquote, as a smaller percentage of 100%, but because of the value increase of the company, it'd probably be a little bit more. So that could be actually a very innovative way to do things and pay things down. You would go to 94.12% the next year if you're giving another 2%, and then you could go all the way down until, 20 years later, you've basically paid out a third of the company. So that sounds like an interesting way to go about things. It kind of seems novel, right? Paying with equity. Well, that's what the ultras actually want to do. But rather than you signing a contract with somebody and giving away equity, the U.S. government does a equity stake voucher, essentially. So instead of a contract saying this is the predetermined amount, it's basically an IOU. Okay, so hey, we're actually getting vouchers. We're getting 2% of your equity in the company every single year. We're getting 2% of that wealth, and we're not actually going to realize any of the gains for it. We're not going to take that in necessarily. But when you do sell that company, when there is an evaluation point, then we will actually realize some of those gains because we have all these vouchers that we've been holding on to as things have gone on. The real interesting question is what happens when you get to 50%. So what if somebody doesn't sell out in the first 20 years, the first 40 years? I mean, obviously the percentage that they're going to get each year goes down a little bit. So it's going to take more than the initial 20 years. It'll probably take I would say 50 years. So if you pass it down from one generation to the next, at that point with the U.S. government, and I don't want to actually do the math, I could actually put it into Excel and it'd be very easy. But the point being, does the U.S. government hold a majority, at least in vouchers, of the equity of your company? That's insane. It's no longer a private company. It's basically a public company. So let's read exactly what the American Institute of Economic Research says about this, because they have a breakdown of the percentages over the next 20 years, but I will actually like their commentary here a little bit more. Quote, the effect is rather startling. Look at the example. In a relatively short time, the government literally takes substantial ownership of all successful private businesses. Rather than being a drawback, advocates actually become excited about government ownership of the metaverse, quote unquote. The giving of the Treasury Secretary extremely broad and unilateral discretion about the use of ultras is in lieu of cash payments. So that's okay. I'll read this last paragraph here that comes immediately after it, but think about it this way. I have complained, we have complained, people complain about the nature of the interaction between Chinese businesses and the Chinese government, and how basically they're just arms. They all have their Chinese Communist Party representatives if they're good little businesses. They have people that liaison with the government, and they have state control over how they move their markets, what policy they're implementing, so on and so forth, and how we've complained about that, how sometimes it put us at a economic disadvantage, but also sometimes how it cripples them because they have to listen to hapless mandates. Like in the real estate market, the Chinese government had to come down hard after that was the huge boom there that was actually boosting their economy and keeping people, quote unquote, it was helping raise them out of debt and out of poverty. And that was one of the main things that allowed them to grow their money, was a lot of the expansion of housing and people buying extra apartments as extra income. And the Chinese government was like, yeah, okay, hands off. We like that. But then the companies got a little bit too big for their boots. They were actually using money for the next apartment that they were selling, because they were selling the futures basically. They were saying, hey, we're going to build this, put down your reservation now, because they're going like hotcakes. They had actually started to use that money for the future apartment on the current apartment complexes so that they could guarantee the money and the building that was paid for by the previous round of investors. It was basically a giant pyramid scheme. So the Chinese government, now with their huge amount of control, they came in hard. They put in crazy regulations, and they've basically flattened that market and trying to get it to re-stimulate. So that's a lot of government control. Do we want that in the United States? Do we want something even akin to that? Do we want a system where, in theory, now whether or not they could actually use those as voting shares in the private businesses is another thing, and that could probably be hashed out. But in theory, that the government owns more than half of your own company? That's absolutely insane. So by the time it's 50 years old, by the time that you reach, so if you started a company at 25, by the time you reach 75, all of that stuff that you have worked for those 50 years, half of it would be gone. Half of it wouldn't even be yours. You couldn't even pass the whole thing down to your kids. You could only pass down 50%. I mean, does that encourage people investing in America, keeping their money here, making sure that they're innovating here? I don't think so. And that's the counter argument to wealth tax, which is, if you want to tax what people bring into the economy, out of the economy, what they're spending, things like that, even hardcore libertarians and even I sometimes would be like, okay, you really need to slow that down. You're taxing too much. You're trying to strip too much wealth away from the people. But at least in those cases, it's money that's going in or out. It's flowing. It's actually helping commerce grow versus the wealth that's just sitting on the sidelines that could be invested in the future. Why just tax that? You're just trying to strip people of what they have in reserve rather than what they're willing to put out there into the economy. It's a very interesting point of view, but I want to read this I got a little bit off track there. I want to read this last paragraph. Quote, since the wealth tax / ultra is only supposed to be imposed on the super rich, of course, this means that it will be necessary to value each person's wealth every year to decide whether or not the ultra will be imposed. But that contradicts the supposed value of the ultra in the first place. So what they're saying here is, okay, the ultras are meant to crack down on the ultra wealthy. We want to use these to to make sure that the ultra wealthy are paying their fair share. Well, then how do we know who the ultra wealthy are? Well, we have to have an assessment of their value. But that was one of the main arguments for the ultras in the first place, which is we don't necessarily know what their value is because some of it's locked up in assets. So it basically becomes arbitrary because they just say, okay, no, you're super wealthy. What's your evaluation on that? Well, you have over this amount. And we think that we need to get a hold of your wealth. But can you actually prove it? No, that's why we're using this system because we can't exactly evaluate where you're at and we want to strip the money from you. It's circular logic, and it's extremely frustrating. So with that, I think we've spent a lot of time. We spent enough time on wealth. We're going to spend a very quick minute on this constitutional amendment that SCOTUS is possibly going to have to face because of a immunity decision in some of the Donald Trump and J6 trials, the trial decisions. So they are going to, and this is when I say they, it's not just the Democrats, it's one person in specific that is putting forward this current amendment. And it's interesting, they had been working behind the scenes, obviously, because the second these decisions came out, they said, okay, we're putting out an amendment. But let me just read the quote from the person that's actually going to do it. Quote, I will introduce a constitutional amendment to reverse SCOTUS's harmful decision and ensure that no president is above the law, Morell wrote on X, aka Twitter. Quote, this amendment will do what SCOTUS failed to do, prioritize our democracy. And then Just the News goes on to say some more. Quote, Morell's constitutional amendment is one of the only ways to challenge the Supreme Court's decision. Because the court is the final arbiter of the law, rulings can be also altered by a new court ruling. So I think it's interesting. I think it's beautiful that our system works this way, that you can still, even though the Supreme Court does something, it's not end all be all. If you think that enough people are on your side and you can convince the representatives of each and every state, which, let's be clear, the representatives are a barrier to seeing things of change like that. So once again, we're returning to that theme of our first article, which may be that the people may actually say, yeah, I 100% agree here. If it was a completely public ballot initiative and you were able to just vote on it to make a new constitutional amendment, maybe it would pass. But there are representatives, and especially with state governments, because we're not just one giant federal government, we are state governments that have their own interests. They would have to send their delegations and vote on it as well. But there are remedies outside of SCOTUS. And this is something that I find beautiful because every single system, every single institution at least has some check or another. Maybe they're not the best checks in the world. Maybe they could be improved, but there is at least an extra check. There is a way for the people to have their voices heard on this issue. And if an overwhelming majority of people agree with this, then we could see things change. Has an amendment come through for quite some time? No, not really. It probably won't change. But at least there's a recourse there. There's a way to vent the steam, so to speak. And I think that's extremely valuable, especially in our fractured times. So, with all that said, I think we've covered enough of the fractious stuff. I want to jump to our daily delight. And this one comes from Parade Pets. Berlin Zoo celebrates birth of adorable pygmy hippo and asks for name suggestions. So I'll be honest, it was actually really interesting to hear about the different secretions that the hippo puts off. It's kind of like a slime or a mucus that is akin to frogs and how it can actually be tampered with. So don't be touching your hippos a little bit too much. Don't dry them out. But the point being that it's really cool to see these sort of endangered animals protected in these different zoos, and honestly, it's a pretty adorable little guy. So if you want to see any of the photos here, you want to hear more about the pygmy hippos, or you want to hear how you can actually put your name in there in the competition at the Berlin Zoo, you can check out this article in the description, or you can also find down there, you can find any of today's articles. They'll all be linked down there, along with the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, Podvine. I strike that. No. Okay, we're going to start that over. Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine. Okay, there is no Google Podcast anymore. I'm going to remove that from my rant, and I have to deprogram my brain because I'm having a hard time. But with all that, you can also find down there the Twitter handle at your DailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. Yes, I know it's X. No, it's still Twitter in my mind. And with all that other stuff out of the way, with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.